Hey guys, my name is SHASWAT and I'm a legal intern at LEXIS and Company. In this video, I will be talking about the concept of delegated legislation. The Constitution of India empowers the legislature to make laws of the country. One of the significant legislative functions is to determine a legislative policy and to frame it as a rule of conduct. Obviously, such powers cannot be conferred on another institution, but keeping in mind various multifarious activities of welfare state, it is not possible for the legislature to perform all the functions. In such situations, the delegated legislations come into the picture. Delegated legislation is one of the essential elements of the administration, whereby the execution has to perform certain legislative functions. However, one must forget that the risk associated with the process of delegation. Very often, an overburdened legislature may unduly exceed the limit of delegation. It may lay down the policy that may declare any of the policy as vague and may set down any guidelines for the executive, thereby without reserving for itself any control over the subordinate legislation. Therefore, even though legislation can delegate some of its functions, it must not lose its control completely over such functions. The delegated legislation, sometimes referred as the secondary legislation or subordinate legislation or subsidiary legislation, is a process in which by execution of authority is given the powers by primary legislation to make laws in order to implement and administer the requirements of the primary legislation. Such law is made by a person or body other than the legislature, but with the legislature's authority. Legislation by any statutory authority or local or other body than the legislation, but under the authority of the competent legislature, is called the delegated legislation. It is the legislation made by a person or a body other than the parliament. Parliament thereby through primary legislation enables others to make law and rules through a process of delegated legislation. Then there is one question that arises: what is the need of delegated legislation? So the process of delegated legislation enables the government to make laws without having to wait for a new act of parliament to be passed. Further, delegated legislation empowers the authority to modify or alter the sections of sanctions under a given statute or make technical changes related to the law. Delegated legislation plays a very important role in the process of making of law, as there is more delegated legislation each year than there are acts of parliament. In some edition, delegated legislation has the same level standing as the act of parliament from which it was created. Delegated legislation is important because it reduces the burden of already overburdened legislature by enabling the executive to make or alter the law under the authority of legislature. Also, it allows to be made by the rules which have been knowledge and experience. Then the process of delegated legislation also plays a role in an emergency situation, since there is no need to wait for a particular act to be passed through the parliament. And finally, the delegated legislation often covers those situations which have not been anticipated by the Parliament during the enacting legislation, which makes it flexible and very useful tool in lawmaking. There are some criticisms on the delegated legislation. Firstly, that it is argued that delegated legislation enables authorities other than the legislations to make and amend laws, thus resulting in overlapping of functions. Secondly, it against the spirit of democracy, as too much delegated legislation is made by unelected people. Also, that the delegated legislation is subject is less parliamentary scrutiny than primary legislation. So I may conclude in the end that we can we must know that delegated legislation is important in the wake of the rise in the number of legislations and technicalities involved. But at the same time, with the rise of delegated legislation, the need to control it also arises, because with the increase in the delegation of powers, it also increases the chance of abuse of the powers. That is it from my side.